They were the enemy, captured, defeated, and shipped to a land they had been taught to fear and hate. They expected torture, starvation, and humiliation. They were prepared for the worst of war, but they were not prepared for a hamburger and a cold, fizzy Coca-Cola. This is not a story about conflict, but about connection, about how a simple meal, served not with scorn, but with startling compassion, began to unravel years of propaganda and hate. This is the story of a taste that changed everything. Narrator, before we witness this incredible moment of humanity, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring more powerful, untold stories like this one directly to you. The train car was a metal box of despair. For 3 days, it had rattled across a landscape so vast it defied Kenji Tanaka's imagination. He sat on a hard wooden slat, his shoulder pressed against a cool, vibrating wall, watching America unfurl through the barred window. Endless fields, towering mountains, and skies that seemed to go on forever. It was nothing like the dense, intimate landscapes of his home in Kyoto. His Imperial Japanese Army uniform, once a symbol of pride, was now a itchy, sweat-stained costume of shame. He was a prisoner of war. Shiojo, the word echoed in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow to his spirit. He replayed his capture on a rocky atoll in the Pacific. The deafening shelling, the hopelessness, the final, surrendering rays of empty hands. Bushido taught him there was no greater dishonor. He should be dead. He had failed his emperor, his family, himself. The man next to him, a young private named Akira, who couldn't be more than 19, whispered, "Tanaka-san, where are they taking us?" Kenji didn't answer. He'd heard the stories, fed every soldier by zealous officers. The Americans were barbarians, kichikabe, demon beasts. They tortured their prisoners. They executed them for sport. They were incapable of honor or mercy. The vast, impersonal scale of this country only confirmed it. Only a nation of monsters could command so much land. The train finally screeched to a halt, throwing the men against each other. Harsh commands in English barked from outside. The doors slid open, flooding the dark car with blinding Arizona sunlight. Squinting, Kenji and the others were marched out onto a dusty platform, surrounded by stern-faced American guards with rifles. But there was no violence, no spit or curses. The guards' eyes were watchful, professional, but devoid of the promised cruelty. This in itself was unnerving. They were marched toward Camp Harmony, a sprawling complex of low, sand-colored barracks surrounded by a high fence and watchtowers. The name was a cruel irony. There could be no harmony here. This was a cage. As they were processed, fingerprinted, photographed, assigned numbers, Kenji kept his head high, his face a mask of stoic defiance, hiding the cold knot of fear in his gut. He was led to Barrack 7, a long, sparse building filled with cots. The air was dry and hot, carrying the unfamiliar scent of creosote and dust. That night, lying on his thin cot, Kenji listened to the quiet sobs of Akira and the others. He stared at the ceiling, his mind a storm of dread and confusion. The Americans' clinical, emotionless efficiency was more terrifying than the promised brutality. It was a void, and he had no idea what it foretold. The uncertainty was its own exquisite torture. What were they waiting for? The fear of the unknown enemy, he realized, was far worse than fear of a known one. The routine of captivity was a strange, tautological war. A war of silence, of sideways glances, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every morning, roll call. Every afternoon, an hour of exercise in the dusty yard under the relentless sun. The guards, mostly young men like themselves, maintained a strict, impassive distance. They were called MPs, military police. Kenji became the de facto leader of Barrack 7. His English was rudimentary, learned from a university professor who had visited California, but it was better than anyone else's. He was the bridge, however fragile, between his men and their captors. A week into their internment, the tension reached a breaking point. During exercise, a guard named Private Miller casually tossed a pack of chewing gum to a group of prisoners. To him, it was a simple, almost childish gesture. To the Japanese soldiers, it was a profound, confusing act. They stared at the brightly wrapped sticks lying in the dust as if they were live grenades. Kenji stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. A test, a trick, poison perhaps, or some form of psychological warfare meant to degrade them. He picked up the pack, his movement slow and deliberate. He looked at Private Miller, whose expression was unreadable behind his sunglasses. Kenji offered the gun back, bowing slightly. "No, thank you," he said, each word carefully measured. Miller shrugged, took the gun back, unwrapped a piece, and popped it into his own mouth. He gave a small, easy smile and walked away. The incident became the subject of fevered debate that night in the barracks. He was showing off his wealth, mocking our poverty, one soldier insisted. It was a test of loyalty. We passed by refusing, argued another. Akira, the young private, voiced a thought that had been gnawing at Kenji. What if he was just being kind? The room fell silent. The idea was so radical, so contrary to everything they'd been conditioned to believe, that it was dangerous. To entertain it felt like a betrayal of their own cause, their own countrymen who had died fighting these very men. Kenji felt the foundation of his reality begin to crack. The Americans weren't acting like demons. They were disciplined, yes, but they whistled tunes while on patrol. They shared cigarettes amongst themselves. They sometimes looked bored or homesick. They were human. This internal conflict was the real battle being waged within the fences of Camp Harmony. It wasn't a battle of guns, but of ideologies. The propaganda he consumed for years was crumbling under the weight of mundane, daily observation. The fear began to morph into a different, more complex emotion, a desperate, terrifying curiosity. Who were these people, really? And if they had been lied to about this, what else had been a lie? The ground beneath Kenji's feet, both literal and philosophical, had never felt less stable. The change in the mess hall routine was immediately obvious. The usual clatter of trays and utensils was replaced by a buzzing, nervous energy. Instead of the familiar vats of plain rice and weak stew that had become their norm, the servers behind the counter were standing next to unfamiliar equipment. Large griddles. A strange, sizzling sound filled the air, and with it a rich, savory, and utterly alien aroma. It was a smell of frying meat and onions, a fatty, greasy scent that was somehow both foreign and deeply appealing to men on a sparse diet. The prisoners shuffled forward in line, their eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and primal hunger. Kenji watched the American cooks. They weren't their usual hurried selves. They moved with focused purpose, cracking eggs, toasting bun halves on the griddle, and placing sizzling patties of ground meat onto them. Next to them, crates of small glass bottles filled with a dark liquid were being opened with a loud, hissing pop. When Kenji reached the front of the line, the cook slapped a strange assemblage on his tray, a toasted bun, a meat patty, a slice of onion, and another bun on top. He then handed him one of the dark, cold bottles, hamburger, and a Coke. The man said, as if those words meant anything. Kenji took his tray and found a seat at the long table, his men gathering around him, all wearing identical masks of bewildered apprehension. They stared at the food as if it were a puzzle from a hostile culture, which it was. "What is this, Tanaka-san?" Akira whispered, poking the hamburger with his finger. "It is some kind of meat sandwich," Kenji replied, his voice low. "And a drink." "It is a trick," an older soldier, Sato, hissed. "They grind up unclean animals, dogs perhaps, to dishonor us, to make us violate our customs. The drink is probably medicine or poison." A tense silence fell over the group. The aroma was tantalizing, but the fear was real. To eat this was to step into the unknown, to accept something from the hand of the enemy. It felt like a surrender of a different kind. Kenji looked around the mess hall. He saw other prisoners having the same silent debate. Some were refusing to touch the food, sitting with their arms crossed. Others were nibbling tentatively, their expressions shifting from suspicion to surprise. He made a decision. As the leader, the burden was his. If it was poison, he would be the one to test it. If it was a dishonorable meal, the shame would be his to bear. He picked up the hamburger. It was warm and greasy in his hands. He brought it to his mouth, his men watching him, their breaths held. He took a bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth. The savory, salted beef, the sweet onion, the soft, slightly toasted bread. It was messy, inelegant, and utterly delicious. It was a taste of profound abundance, of a culture that had so much it could afford to grind good meat and serve it casually to its enemies. He then took a sip from the bottle. The cold, sweet, intensely carbonated liquid was a shock to his system. It fizzed and burned in a thrillingly pleasant way, completely unlike anything he had ever tasted. He looked at his men, their eyes wide, waiting for his verdict. He couldn't speak. The simple, astonishing goodness of the meal had short-circuited his brain. Slowly, he took another bite, and then another, a look of pure, unguarded wonder on his face. That was all the signal they needed. One by one, the men of Barracks 7 picked up their hamburgers. The mess hall won silent, filled with the soft sounds of eating. The tension broke, replaced by a shared, unspoken experience of astonishment. The demon beasts had not given them scraps. They had given them a feast. And in that moment, the entire concept of the enemy began to dissolve, one incredible bite at a time. The hamburger had broken something open. A dam of fear and hostility had been breached, and in its place flowed a cautious, bewildered curiosity. The men in Camp Harmony began to look at their captors not as mythical monsters, but as men, and the Americans, perhaps sensing the shift, began to relax their stern facade in return. Kenji found himself seeking out opportunities for the smallest of interactions. He practiced English phrases in his head, hoping to use them. His chance came a few days later during the afternoon exercise period. He noticed Private Miller, the gum offerer, sitting on an ammo crate, looking at a small photograph he held in his hands. He looked sad. Gathering his courage, Kenji approached the fence that separated them. He stopped a respectful distance away and cleared his throat. Miller looked up, immediately on guard, his hand moving slightly toward a sidearm. Kenji bowed slightly. "The food," he began, struggling for the words. "Hamburger. It was good. Thank you." Miller's posture relaxed. A slow smile spread across his face. Yeah, it's not bad. Better than the crap they usually serve us, too." He gestured with his head toward the American mess hall. There was a moment of awkward silence. Kenji's eyes fell on the photograph in Miller's hand. It was a woman with a young boy on her lap. Miller noticed him looking. He hesitated for a second, then held it out. "My wife. My boy. Jimmy." Kenji looked at the smiling faces. The humanity of it struck him with physical force. This guard, this demon beast, had a family. He missed them. He was just a man, far from home. "I have son," Kenji said, the words feeling thick in his throat. "Hiroshi, 3 years. He mimed holding a baby." Miller's eyes softened. "Yeah, I bet you miss him like crazy." Kenji just nodded. The simple act of connection creating a lump in his throat, he couldn't speak around. This small exchange at the fence became a regular occurrence. Kenji would practice his English. Miller would try to learn a few words of Japanese. They talked about the weather, about baseball, which Kenji had never seen, but Miller described with religious fervor, and about the weight of being so far from home. But this fragile peace was fragile for a reason. Not everyone was adapting. Sergeant Sato, the older soldier who had called a hamburger a trick, watched these interactions with growing disgust. To him, Kenji was fraternizing with the enemy. He was forgetting his duty, his honor, his Bushido code. One evening, as Kenji returned to the barracks after a brief conversation with Miller, Sato confronted him. The other men fell silent. "You disgrace us, Tanaka," Sato spat, his voice low and venomous. "You speak with that animal. You break bread with them. You have forgotten who you are. You have forgotten who they are." "I am learning who they are, Sato-san," Kenji replied, his voice calm but firm. "And they are not what we were told. They are the reason we are in this cage." Sato shouted, drawing the attention of everyone. "Their bombs killed our brothers. And you make friends with them over a piece of meat? You are a fool. You have lost your way." The barracks was split. The younger soldiers, like Akira, looked at Kenji with admiration. They saw hope in his actions. The older, more hardened soldiers sided with Sato, seeing only betrayal. Kenji realized the war wasn't outside the fence. It was right here, inside these walls and inside their hearts. He had found a sliver of common ground with his captor, but in doing so, he was losing the respect of his own countrymen. The path to understanding was proven to be a lonely and dangerous one, threatening to isolate him from the very men he was trying to protect. The greatest challenge to this newfound humanity was, ironically, his own. The conflict with Sato cast a long shadow over Barrack 7. A cold silence replaced the tentative conversations. The men divided themselves, eating and sleeping in separate groups. Kenji felt the weight of his isolation heavily. He believed in the connection he was making, but at what cost? The breaking point came from an unexpected source: the sky. One evening, a massive desert storm rolled in with terrifying speed. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping one of the barack's roof panels clean off and driving horizontal sheets of rain inside. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness and chaos. Men shouted in panic. The storm fury was immense, an impersonal violence that made their human conflict seem petty and small. Kenji, acting on instinct, started shouting orders in Japanese, directing men to move their cots away from the leaking roof, to use their blankets to soak up the water flooding across the floor. In the midst of the chaos, he saw Sato, struggling alone to shove a heavy supply locker against a rattling main door. It was too much for one man. Without a second thought, Kenji rushed to his side. For a moment, Sato resisted his help, his body rigid with pride and anger. But another tremendous gust of wind shook the entire building, a reminder of their shared vulnerability. Sato relented. Together, grunting with effort, they slid the locker into place, barricading the door. They stood there for a moment, panting in the dark, soaked to the bone. No words were needed. The storm was a greater enemy than any American, and in facing it, they were just men again. Just humans trying to stay dry. As suddenly as it had arrived, the storm began to pass. The wind died down to a whisper, and the only sound was a steady drip of water from the ravaged roof. In the eerie quiet, a new sound emerged. Shouts from outside in English. The barack door was shoved open from the outside, pushing the locker back. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. It was the MPs, led by Private Miller, his poncho dripping water. He scanned the room with his light, taking in the soaked, shivering men and the damaged roof. His eyes met Kenji's. "Everyone okay in here?" Miller asked. Kenji nodded. "We are wet, but we are okay." Miller nodded back, then turned and barked orders to the other guards. Within minutes, they were bringing in dry blankets, buckets to catch the drips, and even a few thermoses of hot coffee. Sato watched, stunned, as the demon beasts moved through his home, not with weapons drawn, but with offers of help. One of the younger guards handed him a dry blanket. Sato, his hands trembling, took it. He looked from the blanket to the guard's young, concerned face, and then to Kenji. The last vestiges of defiance and hatred in his eyes finally extinguished, replaced by a dazed, profound confusion. The next morning, the camp was a mess of mud and debris. Everyone, prisoners and guards alike, was put to work cleaning up. There were no sides. There was only the shared task of restoring order. Kenji found himself working alongside Miller, hauling a broken tree branch. "Quite a night," Miller said, shaking his head. "Hi." "Yes," Kenji replied. He looked around at the mixed groups of Japanese and Americans working together in the mud. He saw Sato silently accepting a tool from an American guard. The fence was still there. The war was still raging across the oceans. They were still prisoners and captors. But something fundamental had changed. They had looked into the same storm and seen the same fear. They had shared the same sky. Kenji knew the road ahead would be long and complicated. But as he picked up his end of the branch, and Miller lifted the other, he understood. The first taste of peace hadn't been the hamburger or the Coke. It was this, the simple, unglamorous act of bearing a burden together. It was a taste he knew, finally, that both of them, on either side of the world, truly longed for.